Anyway, we call this type of demand uncompensated. Okay? And or we call it Marshallian. Marshall is a very famous economist. Okay, Marshallian demand curve, uncompensated demand curve. And what is it? Why economists call this uncompensated? Why it is uncompensated? Okay, think about this. Let's go back to the slide here. All right. From E1 to E2, the price effect is what? P1 is cheaper, right? So say this is P1, and this would be Q1. Now, P1 increases, so let it be P2 and Q2. So this point, we call it E1, corresponds to E1, okay? And we call this E2, corresponds to this E2. This E1 corresponds to this E1, and this E2 corresponds to this E2. Is that clear? So everyone's happy with this? Okay? Now, let me ask you a question. On which point, would you feel happier? Would you feel better off?
It depends on
You want to be on E1 or you want to be on E2? If I give you these two options, which one would you select? E1 or E2? Raise your hand if you want an E1. Okay, if you want an E2, raise your hand. Okay, so what's the difference? E1, E2. E1 with this indifference curve makes you better off, right? You feel happier, right? And E2 makes you worse off because it falls on an indifference curve closer to the origin. And if Q1 and Q2 satisfy the property more, the better, then of course E1 is a better choice to choose, right? So you may see something that on this uncompensated Marshallian demand curve, for each point on this demand curve, we are facing different levels of satisfaction, different level of utility, different levels of happiness. Understand what I'm talking about? So, of course, the cheaper the price, the more the quantity we consume and the better off we feel. But now we want to define something new, something we call it compensated demand curve. So after compensation, on that kind of compensated demand curve, you feel the same. You would feel the same. So let's have a look like this. Now, you may check on your slide. So we have E1, E2, and E3, right? These 3 points, E1, E2, and E3. And all these 3 points fall on what? On the same indifference curve. So either E1 or E2 or E3 provides us the same level of satisfaction. We feel the same level of happiness, okay? But the MRS, do you remember what we called MRS? The slope of the indifference curve. The MRS of E1, the MRS of E2, and the MRS of E3 differs. Okay, they differ from each other. So for this one, the highest or the absolute value of the MRS is the highest, which means it corresponds to the most expensive P1 in the middle and the most cheap, the cheapest price of on E3. Okay? So the corresponding price, E3, because the price is the cheapest, so it is the lowest one in the middle and here. Okay? Let me show you on the blackboard, maybe more clearer. Okay. Initially, we have a budget line here, and our consumption will be here, right? So Q2. Q star. Okay? And we make it a price, we call it P star. So initially, it's P star for good one. Good one, P1. All right, so this is the demand when we have this income and the price is set P1 at P1. P star at P star. So we have the optimal consumption for quantity of Q1 would be Q star. Now, if P1 becomes cheaper or P1 decreases, what will happen? It will rotate outside or rotate inside, outward or inward. When P1 becomes cheaper, when the good one is cheaper, P1 decreases. Outward, right? So now we have a new budget line with a lower P1. And you know we have already taught you something like what? Substitution effect, income effect, and their sum becomes price effect. So what about substitution effect? Right? So they are parallel to each other, right? This from here, Q star to here, would be substitution effect. We call it Q tilde. But actually, with the price effect, it may be Q double tilde. All right, so for this point and this point, the price is lower than P star, right? The price is lower than P star. We call this as P tilde. So this point if we connect these 2 points, it is the normal demand curve we have derived. Do you remember? This is how we derive demand. Do you remember that? We call this PCC, right? Price consumption curve, PCC. Do you remember this? So from here to here, the price change, the consumption or the quantity change. So this is the normal or the usual one, as we learned so many years from we were in junior high school, right? And so this is uncompensated Marshallian. But from here to here, this is another demand. We call that compensated or Hickson demand curve. And the difference between this and this, can you try to find by yourself what is the difference between these 2 demand curves?
One is the Hickson is all about the substitution, like it's the definition of the substitution effect and derive the demand curve and the margin. And another demand curve from is the combination between substitution effect and income effect.
Yeah, right. And so this demand curve comes mainly from the substitution effect, right? We only take substitution effect into account so that we have this one, right? And this, not only substitution effect, but also income effect. So it's the total effect, the price effect. But okay, now, why would we do this? And except for the composition, what would be the result for the difference? Because the difference in composition. So if I make 2 options for you, this point or this point, which one would you choose? Would you feel better? This or this? You will choose this one, right? You will feel better off, right? However, what about this point and this point? It's the same, right? There's no difference, right? Because it's indifferent. Why these 2 points are indifferent? Because they correspond to these 2 points. They fall on the same indifference curve, providing us the same level of utility. Okay? So these 2 points, you feel the same. Either one is fine. Oops. Sorry. Ooh. They are the same. They're providing the same utility of level. This one is better than this one. What about this 2? The same price, the more quantity. Of course, this one is better, right? But actually, not is just because of the quantity, because you got to pay more for this. It also depends on other conditions, but intuitively, you will see this point is good, better than this point. So the reason is because this point corresponds to this one, making us feel better because we are falling on the higher indifference curve, right? but these two fall on the same indifference curve. That's the difference, okay? Alright, then let's go in an opposite direction. What about if the price is higher? The indifference curve, it makes us choose this point. So PCC, okay? This is PCC. And we call this Q double prime because I want to use Q prime, Q double prime. And we may shift this one parallelly to here. So is it clear? And we call this Q prime. Alright, what about the price? Now the price becomes higher, right? So we call this P prime. P prime, P star, P tilde, 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 tilde. So now, with this, so you see the usual demand curve, the Marshallian uncompensated, okay? So the best in the middle, the worst. The reason why this point corresponds to the worst case because it falls on the least indifference curve, right? And what about the substitution effect? If we only consider, or if we only take into account the substitution effect, then you find what? This we call the compensated demand curve, or Hicksian demand curve. And points on this demand curve providing us the same level of utility, we feel the same. But here we would feel differently, okay? That is why we call this compensated. Because without compensation, uncompensated, when the price goes up, as the price increases, we feel worse and worse. So we need something to be compensated. Okay? And the reason is because when the price goes up, our real income becomes less. So if there is some compensation on income, which can make us feel the same or indifferent, so we make it compensated. Is that clear? All right. Uncompensated Marshallian demand curve. So consumer utility is allowed to vary with the price of goods. In the figure from the previous slide, utility fell when the price of music checks rose. Okay, this is the music checks. But anyway, it's Q1. So as I told you, when the price goes up, the utility falls. Okay, and compensated Hicksian demand curve. Only the pure substitution effect of the price change is represented in this case, and individual must be compensated with extra income as the price rises. So when the price rises, if you are compensated by some extra income, you can stay with the same indifference curve. However, in the opposite way, if the price goes down and your money, I should take some money from you so that you can be compensated in another way, okay? And stay on the same indifference curve. So in order to hold utility constant, okay? Please highlight this. Let's take a break. It's 9:51. Say 10:05. Okay? See you at 10:05.